My name is Sarah Whitfield. I'm 38 years old, and for the past 14 years I've worked as a forensic accountant, the last 6 of those at a regional firm in Columbus, Ohio, where I specialize in something most people have never heard of until they desperately need it: asset tracing. Companies hire people like me when they suspect an executive has been quietly moving money where it shouldn't go. Divorce attorneys hire me when one spouse insists, with a straight face, that they have no idea where $40,000 disappeared to. Banks hire me when a small business's books don't add up and someone needs to find out why, carefully, and in a way that holds up in court. It is by nature a quiet job. Nobody claps when you find the discrepancy. You write the report, you attach the documentation, and you move on to the next file. But it teaches you something that most people go their whole lives without learning. Paper doesn't lie, and paper doesn't forget. People forget. People rewrite the story in their heads until they believe it. Paper just sits there, dated and signed, waiting for someone to read it properly. I met Daniel when I was 26, at a mutual friend's barbecue in Westerville. He was loud in a way I found charming back then, the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately knew 3 people, who could make a table of strangers laugh within 10 minutes. He owned a small logistics consulting business, Whitfield Freight Solutions, though at the time it was still under his birth name, Daniel Pierce, before we married, and he started using the Whitfield Pierce branding for the company, which I always thought was a strange choice for a man who didn't actually want a partnership. We got married 3 years later, in a backyard ceremony with 60 guests and a barbecue caterer. Daniel negotiated down from $1,800 to $1,200, which I remember thinking at the time was charming, resourceful. I didn't yet understand that negotiating people down was simply how Daniel related to the world, including eventually to me. For the first few years, things were what I'd call normal, functional. I worked my way up at the firm. Daniel's business had good months and bad months, the way small logistics consulting businesses do. A contract with a regional grocery distributor here, a contract that fell through there. We bought the house on Linden Court in 2015 for $312,000. A 3-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch that I loved the moment I saw it. The mortgage was in both our names initially. I want to be clear about that because it matters later. At that point, on paper, we were equal owners of everything. What changed wasn't sudden. It was the slow accumulation of small things, the kind of erosion you don't notice until you're standing on bare rock. By year 7 of our marriage, I'd stopped expecting Daniel to introduce me by name at his work events. I'd stopped expecting him to ask before making decisions about his business, his clients, his company car. I'd become, in his mind and increasingly in his vocabulary, an accessory to his life rather than a partner in it. But I kept working, kept saving, and I kept watching, because watching financial patterns is, professionally and personally, the thing I am best at in the world. And what I was watching, starting around 2021, was a man whose finances were quietly, steadily, catastrophically falling apart. That should have worried me more than it did. It didn't, because I had no idea yet how it would end, or that it would end with him handing me, voluntarily and in writing, the keys to everything he had left. If you'd visited our house on Linden Court any time in the last decade, you would have assumed reasonably that it belonged to Daniel. Not because his name was the only one on the mailbox, it wasn't, but because of the 1,000 small social cues that build a household's identity in other people's minds. When his mother, Carol, visited from Dayton, she'd walk in and say, "Daniel, your house looks wonderful," gesturing at the renovated kitchen I'd spent 8 months researching and budgeting. $34,000 in cabinetry, countertops and appliances, paid for largely from a bonus I'd earned for a fraud case I'd cracked involving a manufacturing client. Daniel would just say, "Thanks, Mom," and never once correct her. Not once in 10 years. Carol had always treated Daniel like the son the rest of the family orbited. His younger sister, Megan, used to joke about it at Thanksgiving. "Mom thinks Daniel invented logistics," but it wasn't really a joke. When Daniel's business landed a new contract, Carol would call to congratulate him, sometimes sending a card with a check inside, $200 or $300, for the office. When I got promoted to senior associate at my firm, a promotion that came with a $14,000 raise and oversight of 4 junior analysts, Carol's response when Daniel mentioned it at dinner was, "That's nice. Is that going to take time away from helping Daniel with the business?" I remember sitting there with my fork halfway to my mouth, doing the math in my head. Not the financial math, the relational math. The math of how many times over 11 years I had been positioned as support staff in a life I was, in every meaningful financial sense, holding together. The second example I think about often happened at his company's holiday party in December 2022, at a banquet hall Daniel had booked for $3,200. Money I knew because I did our taxes. The business genuinely did not have to spare that year. I was introduced to no fewer than 6 people that night as Daniel's better half, or simply not introduced at all. At one point, a new hire, a young woman named Priya Anand, whom Daniel had brought on as an operations coordinator 3 months earlier, asked me what I did. "I'm an accountant," I said. "Oh, like you help with Daniel's books?" she asked, smiling. "No," I said. "Different field entirely." Daniel, overhearing, laughed and said, "Sarah keeps busy with her little projects. I keep the real business running." He said it lightly, the way you'd make a joke at a party, and 3 people near us laughed along. Laughed too. That's the part one think about now. I laugh too because that's what you do, in the moment, when correcting the record would make everyone uncomfortable and you've already learned that your comfort is the one that's negotiable. The third example is the one that, looking back, I think was the actual beginning of the end, though at the time it just felt like another Tuesday. In March 2023, Daniel told me he wanted to refinance the house to free up some capital for the business. He needed me to sign off since I was still a co-owner on the mortgage. I asked reasonably what the capital was for. He said opportunities, a word he used a lot that year, always vaguely, always followed by a change of subject. I signed the refinance paperwork because at that point I trusted him, and because the alternative, turning every financial conversation in our marriage into an interrogation, felt exhausting in a way I didn't have the energy for after 60-hour work weeks. What I didn't know in March 2023 was that opportunities meant a sports betting app on his phone that I would later learn, through documents I had every legal right to see, had processed over $61,000 in losses across 14 months. What I also didn't know was that the refinance had pulled $48,000 in equity out of our house. Equity that was, at that point, largely gone within 5 months. I found out the full picture in October 2023, not because Daniel told me, but because a collections agency called our landline asking for Daniel Pierce, also known as Daniel Whitfield Pierce, regarding an outstanding balance of $9,400 on a personal line of credit I had never heard of, opened that February. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad. The same kitchen table where, 11 months later, Daniel would tell me to start packing my bags, and I asked him to tell me everything. All of it. Every account, every debt, every dollar. What he didn't know was that by asking him to lay it all out in front of me, on paper with dates and balances and account numbers, I wasn't just trying to understand our marriage. I was building a file. That conversation in October 2023 lasted almost 4 hours. Daniel cried twice, which I had only seen him do once before, at his father's funeral in 2019. By the end of it, the picture was this: $61,000 in gambling losses over 14 months. $9,400 on an undisclosed line of credit. $22,000 in unpaid business taxes from Whitfield Freight Solutions, which Daniel had been meaning to deal with. A business line of credit, $35,000, almost fully drawn, with 2 missed payments already flagged. And the house, our house, the one we'd bought together for $312,000, now carrying a mortgage balance close to its actual market value, after the refinance had stripped most of the equity. "If the business creditors come after me," Daniel said, staring at the legal pad like it was something that had bitten him, "they can come after everything. The house. cars. Even my retirement accounts eventually if it gets bad enough. I could lose all of it, Sarah. Everything I've built. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because the version of this story where I felt nothing but cold calculation isn't true. Felt afraid. I felt the particular fear of someone who has worked 60-hour weeks for over a decade, who has never missed a mortgage payment in her own name, suddenly looking at the possibility of losing the house she loved because of debts she hadn't incurred and hadn't known about. But underneath the fear, I felt something else too. The same feeling I get at work when a client hands me a folder of disorganized financial records and says, "I don't even know where to start." A kind of clarity. 'Cause I did know where to start. I always know where to start. There's a way to protect the house, I said. And the cars. And probably the business, if we're careful about how it's structured. Daniel looked up. How? You put everything in my name, I said. All of it. The house, the cars, the business assets. Restructured so I'm the sole owner on paper. My name isn't on any of these debts. If creditors come after your assets, they can't touch what's legally mine. I watched him think about it. I watched him weigh his pride. The pride of a man who had spent 11 years making sure everyone knew whose name was on things, against the very real, very immediate fear of losing his father's old truck, the house his mother complimented every visit, the business that was the only thing that made Carol look at him with anything resembling pride, the fear one. It took him 3 days to ask me to start the paperwork, but the fear one. It's just on paper, he said, the day he finally agreed, signing the first set of documents at our kitchen table with a pen he'd borrowed from my work bag. It doesn't change anything between us. It's just protection. I understand, I said. And I did understand, better than he did, in fact, exactly what we were doing. Over the following 4 months, with the help of my colleague Rima, who specializes in asset restructuring for small business owners going through financial distress, we transferred the deed of the house on Linden Court into my name alone. A clean, fully legal transfer, recorded with the Franklin County Recorder's Office in January 2024, no liens, no encumbrances beyond the existing mortgage, which Daniel refinanced a second time, this time solely in my name, qualifying based on my income and credit, which, unlike his, was excellent. The two vehicles, a 2021 Honda CR-V and Daniel's 2019 Ford F-150, both had their titles transferred to me as well, for insurance purposes, Daniel said, though the real purpose was the same as everything else. And Whitfield Freight Solutions. The business Daniel had built, the business his mother bragged about, the business he'd told a room full of his employees that he kept running while I handled my little projects, was restructured in February 2024 as a single-member LLC with one listed member, me. Daniel became, on paper, an employee. Consultant. A man with a salary, a title, and zero ownership stake in the company that bore his name. He signed every document. He sat across from a notary 3 separate times, and signed his name to paperwork that made me the sole legal owner of the house we lived in, the cars in our driveway, and the business he'd spent 15 years building. It's just paper, he said again, the last time, sliding the signed operating agreement back across the table to Rima. None of this changes anything real. I remember not correcting him. I remember thinking very calmly that he was about to learn exactly how real paper could be. What he didn't know was that I'd also opened a new business checking account for Whitfield Freight Solutions LLC, one where I was the sole authorized signatory, and where, starting in March 2024, all client payments were redirected per the new operating agreement. Daniel still had access to the old account, which I'd quietly stopped funding, transferring operating capital to the new account as it came in. He didn't notice for months because I made sure the bills still got paid, the payroll still cleared, and nothing about his day-to-day life changed at all. That was the moment everything shifted, not the morning he told me to pack my bags, 11 months later. That was just the moment he finally found out. I found out about Priya in June 2024, 4 months after the restructuring was complete, in a way that was almost embarrassingly mundane. Daniel left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he showered, and a message notification popped up on the screen. A calendar reminder of all things for dinner, 7 p.m. Marcello's. I wasn't looking for anything. I genuinely wasn't. But once you've spent 14 years training your eye to notice when numbers don't add up, you develop an unfortunate secondary skill: noticing when stories don't add up either. Daniel had told me he had a client dinner that night. I didn't confront him. Not then. I want to be honest. Part of why I didn't confront him wasn't strategy at first. It was exhaustion. I had just closed out the most demanding case of my career, a fraud investigation involving a regional construction firm that resulted in $1.4 million in recovered funds, and I genuinely did not have the emotional bandwidth in June 2024 to blow up my marriage on top of everything else. So I watched, quietly, the way I'd been trained to. Over the following months, the pattern confirmed itself in small, undeniable pieces. Client dinners that didn't appear on the business calendar I now had full access to. A new cologne, $145 Tom Ford, charged to a personal credit card I could see because, as it turned out, I was now the primary account holder on 3 of our 4 shared cards, a detail from the restructuring that Daniel apparently hadn't thought through. A weekend business trip to Cleveland that didn't correspond to any client meeting, expense report, or mileage log in the LLC's records. Records I, as the sole member, was now legally required to maintain. By September 2024 I knew. Priya Anand, 26 years old, the operations coordinator who'd once asked me if I helped with Daniel's books, had been in a relationship with my husband for at least 4 months, probably longer. I didn't say anything for 2 more months. Not out of weakness, out of the same instinct that had guided every other decision in this story. I wanted to understand the full shape of it before I responded to any part of it. What I learned by November was this: Daniel had told Priya at some point that he was going through a divorce and that the house on Linden Court was his, that he'd be keeping it, and that Priya could move in once Sarah finds a place. I know this because Megan, Daniel's sister, who had never been particularly close to me, but who apparently had limits when it came to watching her brother humiliate someone, called me in late November. "I don't know if you know this," Megan said, her voice tight, "but Daniel's telling people you two are basically done. And that Priya's moving into the house. Or house. I thought you should know. Before everyone else does." "Thank you, Megan," I said. "I appreciate you telling me." I hung up the phone, sat with it for a moment, and then did something I want to describe carefully, because it's the only moment in this entire story where I felt something close to satisfaction before the ending even arrived. I opened a folder on my laptop, a folder I'd been quietly maintaining since January, labeled with my characteristic lack of drama, house documents, and I printed 3 things. The recorded deed to the house on Linden Court, dated January 18, 2024, showing me as sole owner. The titles to both vehicles, transferred to my name in February 2024. And the cover page of the operating agreement for Whitfield Freight Solutions LLC, showing me as the sole member, dated February 9, 2024. 11 months, almost to the day, before Daniel would stand in our bedroom doorway and tell me it was time I remembered whose house this was. I put the folder in the drawer of my nightstand. And I waited. What they didn't know, neither Daniel nor Priya, was that the clock had already started. They just didn't know it yet. The morning Daniel told me to pack my bags was December 14, 2024. A Saturday. I'd known it was coming for almost 2 weeks, ever since Megan's call, because Daniel had started in small ways rehearsing for it. He'd brought home flattened moving boxes from the U-Haul on Cleveland Avenue and left them in the garage, just in case we need them for the holidays. He'd mentioned twice that Priya's lease was ending January 1st. He'd started saying "my house" with a strange, deliberate emphasis, like he was trying the words on before wearing them in public. So when he stood in the bedroom doorway that Saturday morning and said, "You need to be out by tonight. This is my house, Sarah," I wasn't surprised. I'd had 2 weeks to decide exactly how this moment would go. I smiled, told him I'd start packing, and I want to be clear about what packing actually meant that day, because it wasn't just clothes. I went into my home office, a converted spare bedroom that Daniel had once joked was my little command center, which in retrospect was more accurate than he knew, and I made 4 phone calls. The first was to Rima, my colleague, who I asked to email me, that same afternoon, certified copies of all 3 transfer documents: the deed, the vehicle titles, and the LLC operating agreement. She had them to me within 2 hours. The second call was to my attorney, a woman named Diane Castellano who I'd worked with on 2 prior cases and who, conveniently, also handled residential real estate. I explained the situation, calmly, in the way you'd describe a case file, because that's what it was. Diane confirmed what I already knew. As sole owner of the property, I had every legal right to determine who resided there, and the person currently occupying the home without an ownership interest, lease, or other legal claim, namely my husband, could be asked to vacate. Given that we were still legally married and he had been residing there, the cleanest approach, Diane advised, was a written notice giving him a reasonable period to make alternative arrangements. 30 days was more than generous, and would also strengthen our position if this became part of divorce proceedings, which Diane gently pointed out it almost certainly would. The third call was to my bank, regarding the joint accounts. There were 2 left, both checking accounts we used for shared household expenses. I didn't close them. I simply moved my direct deposits, both my salary and the LLC's now redirected distributions, into accounts solely in my name, effective the following pay cycle. Daniel's salary from the LLC, which I, as sole member, technically controlled, I left untouched. I wasn't trying to leave him destitute. I was simply making sure that, going forward, my money was mine on paper, the same way his had insisted on keeping things for the last 11 years. The fourth call was to Whitfield Freight Solutions' largest client, a regional grocery distributor that accounted for roughly 40% of the LLC's revenue. This call wasn't strategic in the sense of being aimed at Daniel directly. It was simply due diligence I, as sole member, was required to handle anyway. Their annual contract renewal was due January 1st, and as the legal owner of the LLC, I was the one who needed to sign it. I told them I'd have the renewal reviewed and returned within the week. I didn't mention anything about Daniel's personal life. I didn't need to. By 6 o'clock that evening I had 2 suitcases packed, real ones with my actual clothes, because I genuinely did intend to spend the night at a hotel, both to give Daniel space to absorb what was coming and because, frankly, I didn't want to be in the house when he opened the folder. I left the folder on the kitchen table. Inside it, the certified deed, the vehicle titles, the LLC operating agreement, and a 1-page letter from Diane Castellano, on firm letterhead, formally notifying Daniel Pierce that, as he was residing in a property he did not own without a lease agreement, he was being given 30 days, until January 13, 2025, to vacate the premises at 4417 Linden Court. I left a post-it note on top of the folder. It said only, "You're right. This isn't your house. It's never been your house. S." Then I picked up my suitcases, walked to my car, the 2021 Honda CR-V, titled in my name since February, and drove to the Hilton on Polaris Parkway, where I checked in, ordered room service, and slept better than I had in over a year. What Daniel didn't know, as he opened that folder alone in the kitchen of a house he'd just told his girlfriend would be hers in 2.5 weeks, was that I'd already forwarded copies of everything to Diane that morning, time-stamped in case he tried to claim he'd never received it. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't, not quite. There was still 1 phone call left to make, and Daniel made it himself at 11:47 that night, and I let it go to voicemail. Daniel called me 3 times that night: 11:47 p.m., 12:15 a.m., and 1:03 a.m. I let all 3 go to voicemail. The first one I listened to the next morning, over coffee at the hotel. His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Not angry, not even pleading exactly. Disoriented. "Sarah, I don't understand. This says you own the house. Cars. This says I don't own the business. I built that business. Call me back. Please. I didn't call back that day. I let him sit with the folder for 24 hours because I knew, from years of watching men like Daniel manage crises badly, that he'd spend that day calling people, and that those calls would do most of my remaining work for me. He called his mother first. I know this because Carol called me on December 16th, and for the first time in 11 years, her voice didn't have that particular tone, the tone that had always suggested I was a pleasant but minor character in Daniel's story. "Sarah," she said, "Daniel says there's been some kind of mistake with the house paperwork. Can you help him sort it out?" "There's no mistake, Carol," I said. "Daniel asked me to take ownership of everything in January 2024, to protect it from his gambling debts. He signed the documents himself, in front of a notary, 3 separate times. I have copies of everything if you'd like to see them." There was a long silence. "His gambling debts," Carol repeated. "$61,000 over 14 months, I said. "Plus the unpaid business taxes. Plus the personal line of credit he didn't tell me about. I can send you the documentation, if it would help you understand the timeline. I want to note for the record that I didn't send Carol anything unsolicited. I never called Daniel's family, never posted anything, never told a single person outside Diane, Rima, and my own sister what was happening, until they came to me. But once they came to me, I told the truth with documentation every time. That's not revenge. That's just what happens when you ask a forensic accountant a direct question." Daniel called Megan next, apparently, and Megan, who had warned me about Priya in the first place, told him gently but firmly that if everything was signed and notarized the way I described, there probably wasn't much to sort out. The business client, the grocery distributor, called Diane's office directly on December 18th. Their procurement director had apparently received a call from Daniel, the previous day, attempting to explain that there might be a change in company ownership, and that he wanted to discuss continuity. Diane confirmed to them accurately that Whitfield Freight Solutions LLC was solely owned and operated by me, that all existing contracts remained valid and would be honored, and that the January 1st renewal would proceed as scheduled, signed by me as sole member. The client's response, relayed to me secondhand, was simple relief. They didn't care who owned the company, as long as the trucks kept running and the invoices stayed accurate. The contract renewed on schedule, for $340,000 annually, the LLC's largest single account. Priya, I later learned, found out about all of this on December 20th. Not from Daniel, but from a mutual coworker who'd heard about the ownership situation through Megan, who'd heard it from Carol, who, despite her initial shock, apparently could not resist mentioning it to at least one person at her book club. Priya's lease, as it turned out, was not ending January 1st after all. That detail, like several others, had been one of Daniel's small inaccuracies. But she did move out of the relationship, if not the apartment, by the new year. I never spoke to her, and I never needed to. By January 13th, 2025, the 30th day, Daniel had moved into a 1-bedroom apartment off Cleveland Avenue, paying $1,150 a month, the first place he'd lived in 11 years that didn't have my name attached to a single document inside it. He took his clothes, his late father's tools from the garage, and the F-150, which, as it turned out, I let him keep. Not out of generosity exactly. Diane and I had agreed it made the eventual divorce settlement simpler, and frankly, I never needed 2 vehicles. The divorce was finalized in April 2025. Because the house, the second car, and the business were never marital assets to begin with, they were solely mine, transferred well before any separation, with full documentation of intent and execution. There was almost nothing to divide. Daniel kept his salary from the LLC for another 2 months, until he found a position at a competing logistics firm in March, at which point I let his consulting arrangement with Whitfield Freight Solutions lapse, amicably on schedule. On the morning of January 14, 2025, the day after Daniel's 30 days expired, the day the locks were rekeyed, though he'd already gone, I sat on the wraparound porch of the house on Linden Court with a cup of coffee, watching the frost melt off the railing in the early light. The CRV was in the driveway. The F-150 was gone. The business renewal sat, signed, in a folder in my office. $340,000 secured for the year. I thought about the post-it note. You're right. This isn't your house. It's never been your house. It had never felt more true or more mine. People sometimes ask me when they hear this story whether I planned it from the beginning, whether back in 2023 when I agreed to take ownership of everything for protection, I already knew how it would end. I didn't. Not really. I just did what I'd always done. I kept the record straight, I signed what I was asked to sign, and I made sure I understood exactly what I owned. Turned out that was enough. I think about all those years of being introduced as someone's better half, of being the quiet one in rooms where my own competence was treated as a footnote to someone else's story. I used to think the goal was to be seen, to finally get the credit, the recognition, the moment where everyone realized how much I'd been carrying. But that's not what freedom turned out to feel like. Freedom felt like a Tuesday morning on my own porch, in my own house, with nobody in the room to perform for. If you've ever been the invisible one in your own family, the one whose contributions got quietly absorbed into someone else's story, I hope you remember this. Being underestimated was never the truth about you. It was just something other people believed, right up until the paperwork said otherwise. If this story resonated with you, tell me where you're listening from.